My main purpose in pursuing this project was to explore the presence of rhetoric in Byzantine art. I first fell in love with this topic when I read an article by Sarah Bassett analyzing the rhetorical properties of the imperial panels at San Vitale. After that, I started to explore different works and the effect rhetoric has had on religious art. I decided to go with Annunciation scenes after we reviewed the frescoes in the Church of St. George in Kurbanovo, Macedonia. I fell in love with not only the handling of the angel Gabriel and Mary, but how the artist incorporated the arch into the composition. My project cascaded nicely from there. In my exploration of rhetoric in Byzantine art, I used Art and Eloquence in Byzantium by Henry Maguire as my stepping stone for my analysis and my primary source of information on rhetoric. The four main rhetorical devices I used to analyze the case studies were ekphrasis, antithesis, hyperbole, and lament. Ekphrasis is description used for people, settings, actions, seasons, etc. Antithesis is the juxtaposition of two conflicting ideas such as the Dormition and the Nativity. Hyperbole is the exaggeration of a truth for the sake of amplification, and lament is when a character is sorrowful when contrasted with either past happiness or with regards to future suffering. This device, in particular, is very common for depictions of Mary, which carries over into the Annunciation. One interesting thing I discovered in my reading about these devices was the influence of pagan rhetoric on sermons and depictions of religious scenes. This specifically correlates to the massacres and martyrdoms common to liturgical literature. One example I found was the Berlin Ivory of the 40 Martyrs of Sebast and many other versions of this mass martyrdom. Usually martyrs were depicted as indifferent, but in this work and many that followed, the martyrs were seen writhing in agony, a new development in Byzantine art. Three key scenes of the Virgin in the Greek Orthodox Church are the feast day scenes of the Annunciation, the Nativity, and the Dormition. She is also frequently depicted embracing her child and presenting him to the viewer. Specifically in Annunciation scenes, she is usually depicted as sitting and sad. She is usually reacting to Gabriel's greeting by shrinking from him and wearing a shocked and somber expression. Usually in these scenes, she is shown holding a spindle of thread in varying shades of red and violet. In Byzantine representations, there are also usually indications of spring and very little background context, limited to a portico and a building or two. The first feast day in the Christian calendar is the Annunciation and is one of the most important in Christendom. This was the day that the angel Gabriel came to Mary and told her that she was not only pregnant, but that she was carrying the Son of God. The Immaculate Conception and her purity is what placed her above all and makes her worthy of worship and veneration. This scene is the beginning of the life of Christ, the Incarnation, and it is the pivotal point in history when Christ was conceived and Christianity was born. This day is so important to the Church that Gabriel's greeting even became a part of the Ave Maria prayer. After researching Rhetoric, Mary, and the Annunciation, I began my analysis of my four main case studies. These were a squinch mosaic from the Church of the Dormition in Daphne, the fresco from the Church of St. George in Kurbanovo, and two smaller icons, a tempura in gold from St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai, and a panel painting from the Parableptos Church in Ohrid. These four works all differed in size, time period, and medium used, along with variations in setting. All but the fresco featured a gold background and spindle. The mosaic was the only one without any architectural background. The tempura in gold featured the most pronounced spring imagery, and the panel painting, as the newest, had the most dynamic interaction between Gabriel and Mary with the flowing robes, widespread feet of Gabriel, and the gesture Mary is making to reject what Gabriel has told her. All of the works featured the four rhetorical strategies, from the handling of the figures and setting, to the way Mary reacted negatively to what should have been good news, to the exaggeration of Mary's garments and throne to represent her divine status as Queen of Heaven. Rhetorical style has changed over time, but the foundational principles remain the same and ever present in visual and verbal art. These principles have been around since Aristotle and continue to be used and modified with time according to the needs of the contemporary writer. These devices are what allow artists to communicate effectively with their audiences in order to persuade them. While this was a small sample of all Annunciation art from the Byzantine Empire, they included a wide range of styles, sizes, and rhetorical strategies. Each is tied to the other by the long-standing traditions governing depiction of this scene. The purpose of religious art was to express what the verbal speeches and literature could not. To create a more material representation of the divine settings and individuals of the Church and communicate the messages to a universal audience. Churches and religious buildings are replicas of the cosmos for religious man. The thresholds are the limit, the boundary, the frontier that distinguishes and opposes those two worlds, and the art is just one of the methods of worship and becoming one with God.